Okay, welcome everyone to today's learning session with the SI London Hub. My name is Josh Colchester. We're going to be learning about the multi-level perspective today in our 60 minutes session working on our mirror board. Thank you all for joining. If everybody could please mute themselves, that'd be great. So here we are. I'm going to share the mirror board link with you now. Hope you'll join me soon. We're going to start off with a little presentation so you understand what we're talking about. What is this multi-level perspective? And then we're going to jump into a canvas. So let me quickly show you what we'll be covering today. Here it is. So we can see here we're learning about the SI guides. Maybe you've joined us in previous sessions. We've been covering a number of these guides so far. We're maybe in about session number 10 at this stage, I would say. This is a series of guides that cover all the ideas and methods of systems innovation. You'll find them on our website. You'll find them by clicking on here. And you go to systemsinnovation.io and you type in guides and you'll find all the guides there. So these are they. We started off with an introduction to systems innovation, and then we covered all these ones in the sections on system thinking here, and complexity theory and so forth. And then we looked at, sorry, just mute everyone there. And then we looked at, in the current section we've been working through, we've been looking at systems mapping. So we looked at all these different guides here. Last time we were talking about actor mapping. Maybe some of you were there. This time we're talking about multi-level perspective. So as we'll talk about today, this is a way of understanding and modeling and thinking about transition processes within complex adaptive systems. So that's where we are today. In future sections, we'll be looking more at the guides on systems change and then on systems building. But let's jump into where we are today. This is what we're going to cover. First, they're going to talk a high-level overview. What are we talking about here? Multi-level perspective. And then we're going to look at socio-technical systems, which is the idea that we're talking about, coevolution, how they evolve over time, a lock-in and path dependency. We'll zoom into this actual model that we're talking about and the different levels here. We'll then understand it as a theory of change. We'll choose a system that we want to explore. And then we'll jump into the canvas here so you get an idea of how this works in practice and get to post your stickies up. Okay, so that's what we're covering. Let's go back to the beginning here and start with what it is we're talking about. What is this multi-level perspective? As mentioned, you'll find it here on the website. We have both the guide under the guides for multi-level perspective. We also have that canvas I just showed you. You'll find that on the website. So, could everybody please mute themselves? Okay, there we go. So this idea comes from this gentleman here, Frank Giels. He's a professor of systems innovation and sustainability at the University of Manchester. He's actually originally in the Netherlands. And he developed this model. I'm sure it's based upon many previous ideas, but this is what it looks like. We'll be unpacking this as we go through today. As mentioned, he's a professor of systems innovation. He's thinking about how these kind of large-scale transformations and transition processes happen in complex adaptive systems. And this is an interesting quote he has, that where he tries to describe systems innovation. So what is systems innovation? I would suggest that it's about changes in the way we fulfill societal functions. So how the society fulfills mobility or energy or food or entertainment or healthcare. So it's about a change in socio-technical systems. It's a shift from one system, from one energy system, from one food system, from one healthcare system to another. So that's how this gentleman, Mr. Frank Giels, is describing systems innovation. And then he's trying to come up with a model to talk about that change process, that transition, And that's what the multi-level perspective is. As we'll see here, it's a prominent framework. Just mute people. There we go. So it's a prominent framework for describing transition processes in complex socio-technical systems as it plays out on many different levels. This model has been designed to help us analyze and better understand the long-term, multidimensional, and fundamental transformation processes through which established socio-technical systems shift to a more sustainable mode of production and consumption. The canvas we're going to use is designed to help us help participants think about change on these different levels and how it may be used to enable disruptive innovation. So this is it here, the model. It has 3 levels to the system. On the highest level is this idea of the landscape. These are the big changes that are happening in the system's environment. Here we have the regime, which is the existing dominant paradigm or way of doing things within that system. It's the established institutions and patterns of organization, patterns of working, and how things get done. And down at the bottom, we have the niche, which are the new innovations that are being introduced into that system and potentially will disrupt it and enable a transition process to a new paradigm within the system. So that's the multi-level perspective, obviously called multiple levels because it's looking at the system on different levels, and it's asking about how does change happen in complex adaptive systems through these big changes in the landscape that introduce disruptions for the existing regime, and that enables new niche innovations to enter in here and potentially disrupt, transform, and build new patterns of organization, new patterns, new ways of working, new ways of doing things to ultimately realize systems change. So that's what we talk about, and we're going to kind of unpack that. Obviously, a lot to what I just talked about there is a very high-level overview, and we're going to kind of unpack some of the different dimensions to that and exactly how this works. So the first thing is this idea of a socio-technical system. This is an approach to the study and design of complex organizations and technologies that recognizes the interaction between people and technology as a defining factor in the overall system's makeup and functioning. So it's really saying these systems that we're interested in, these complex adaptive systems, whether it's an energy system, whether it's a financial system, whether it's a healthcare system, they're composed of many interrelated parts, both technical, economic, social, environmental. They're multidimensional, right? So if you do think about energy as an example, it's not just about energy, right? It's not just about electricity and electrons and fossil fuels. It's obviously about regulation. It's about consumer behavior. It's about marketing, advertising. It's about money and business models. It is about technology. It is about the environment. It's about how we use natural resources, so on and so forth. So it's saying it's this massively complex system that's incredibly multidimensional with both economic, social, and technical factors all involved. And that's the kind of starting position that we're asking about. How does change happen within something that looks like that? So it is a holistic approach, right? That's kind of where it starts. It's decisively holistic in nature. It does not search for any single solution as how and why transitions may occur, but instead takes a broad overview of different scales, dimensions, and timeframes. This model takes a systems approach by starting with the perspective that at any level, economies are organized into systems. In the system, every element is interrelated to everything else. And in diagnosing problem solutions as systems, problem situations as systems, there could be many sides and multiple levels to consider. Thus, taking different points of view from different levels of perspective is beneficial. So these are kind of the key aspects of large-scale socio-technical systems. They're multidimensional. As mentioned, there are multiple scales to them. Change is happening on many different levels. They're co-evolving, as we'll talk about that now in the next board. There's this interesting aspect that things evolve in relation to other things. And history matters, right? History is very important. We never get to kind of start from the beginning. If we're going to change the energy system in Cambodia or wherever it is in China, we never get to start from a clean slate, right? There's a long history, there's a grid, there's an energy system there already, and we have to work with that. And that's a very important consideration of this. Okay, so the first one here is coevolution. Maybe you've heard of this term, maybe not. Socio-technical system transitions are coevolutionary, as different levels and different dimensions of the system have to adapt to each other's changes. The success of many innovations is predicated upon them fitting in with the changes in other parts and the overall paradigm. Technological developments occur intertwined with societal needs, wants, and uses. Diffusion happens not in a deterministic fashion, but based on the interplay between the innovation, other changes in the system, and socio-technical requirements. So it's very much like in nature, right? Different creatures interact and they evolve. So when, for example, the flowers, the bulb for the flower grows longer, this little bird that wants to get the nectar inside that bulb, it's going to have to evolve a longer beak, right? So over time, as the bulb gets longer, as the entrance to the petal gets longer, the bird's actually going to have to co-evolve with that if it's going to survive. So that's the idea of coevolution, and that happens everywhere in socio-technical systems, right? When we change from one energy system to another, a whole new set of possibilities are going to open up because there'll be new patterns. For example, if we think about electric vehicles, right? Once the electric car is introduced, then there's a possibility of putting in a lot of fueling stations, charging stations. Those things will have to co-evolve together, right? That's the idea of co-evolution. And it creates this idea of a paradigm, right? It's not just a system, it's not just one thing. Frank Giels, in his work, he studied a lot the evolution of the automobile, particularly in America, and how that rose to prominence. And we know that the car is not just the car, right? It's many different things that had to evolve, co-evolve to get us to where we are in terms of the dominance of personal automotive transportation. So we obviously had to develop the car, but we also had to develop roads. We had to develop the fuels. We had to develop the fueling stations. We had to develop traffic lights. We had to develop the whole set of signs and symbols, the whole set of rules, parking stations, you know, all the rules around the laws, the regulations, so on and so forth, right? So it's a whole paradigm, technological paradigm and social paradigm and economic paradigm that system, that's what that system is. Okay. So that's the idea of a paradigm, right? We're never dealing with things in isolation. They always co-evolve. They always exist in relation to other things. And that's part of why change, we'll talk about it now in a minute, it's part of why history matters. And it's part of why change can be difficult, right? Because these things, it's not, if you just change the car, then that's not actually going to change the system, is it, right? We might think that it's just the car. We might just want to change this car to an electric car, but if the whole system around it doesn't evolve, well, then you're going to have problems, and you're probably going to revert back to the old system because you haven't got the charging station, you haven't got the regulation, you haven't got the consumer behavior, so on and so forth. So that's an important aspect here. You have to consider the whole system and how all of this interrelates. And yeah, if you want to look into Frank Giels' work, he does some really interesting stuff around the evolution of the automobile and how all of that came to pass. So part of this is this idea of path dependence, right? And this gets the idea of history matters and Lockin. Maybe you've heard of this idea. So path dependence, the concept is used to capture the way in which small historically contingent events can set off self-reinforcing mechanisms and processes that lock in particular ways of development. The result is that the current system, set of decisions faced by any given circumstance is limited by the decisions made in the past, and that may have locked us into a given paradigm that is now expensive for us to get out of, or even through past circumstances those past circumstances may no longer exist or be relevant. For example, the QWERTY keyboard. So we all use a QWERTY keyboard nowadays. That's not actually the optimal way of organizing a keyboard. But we still use it because it was introduced a long time ago, and it's a pattern that came to dominate in all our keyboards and so forth. So everybody who learned to type now wants to use a QWERTY keyboard, because we all know how to type on a QWERTY keyboard and we don't know how to type on others. So we've got a certain lock-in that we don't want to move out of, and that makes it very difficult for the system to change. Carbon lock-in is another very good example of that, right? Now that we've developed a very sophisticated system, or fossil fuel lock-in, should I say, we've developed a very sophisticated system for extracting, finding, processing, transporting, and using fossil fuels. It's very difficult for us to shift out of that because we have a whole system. We're actually locked into that system because of history. So this here is just a little illustration of the process of rationalization and development of a new technology. We start off here, where there's a lot of new possibilities. When we started, shifted from horse-drawn carriage to the automobile, we had a lot of new possibilities about how we might do automotive transportation and how we might provide fuel, and what fueling stations might look like. Over time, we came to converge upon a set of solutions. Until now, it's very standardized, right? How we do the tires on the car, how we do the fueling stations, regulations, so forth, is very much standardized. And it becomes converges upon a particular pattern and becomes rationalized. So that's an important aspect in the context of socio-technical transformation, because as we say, as mentioned, we can't just change one part. Once we've developed a whole system, we've got to change many different parts across the system, right? Just changing the car isn't going to work. Okay. So here's the model. That was a bit of background for us to understand socio-technical systems. This is the model. And there are 3 levels to it. As mentioned, on the high level, it's the overall landscape. This is the context or environment within which the system exists. So let's take a look at that. The landscape represents the overall environment within which the system exists. The landscape forms the external structures or context for interaction of actors. The landscape level is defined as the exogenous, broader contextual developments in underlying cultural patterns, geopolitical arrangements, macroeconomics, macropolitics, so on and so forth. For example, the industrial age forms an overall technological context. Likewise, the Anthropocene forms an overall socio-ecological context. So these here are examples of some of those landscape changes and processes: the Industrial Revolution, the Green Revolution, agriculture, globalization, mass production, consumer society, information age, so on and so forth. They're long-term major processes of change that basically affect everyone.
Okay. I'll bring all of that.
Then on the meso level, this is the meso level here, persistent configurations that form the dominant pattern of organization in the system. So the meso level is a level of the regimes, which are persistent configurations of markets, infrastructure, technology, policy, and so on, that have settled into stable configurations. So this is the dominant way that we do things, right? In education, in finance, we've got centralized banking and a national-based financial system. In whatever healthcare, we know how things are done. We've all grown up in this system. This is what we mean by the regime. It's a dominant way of doing things. From a systems theory perspective, the regime would represent the overall structure of the system within which elements find themselves, the way they are interrelated, the existing pattern to the flow of resources, the rules, policies, and protocols that structure this. Okay, and then down on the meso level, or the micro level, sorry, the micro level is the home to the new innovations and the new ways of doing things. So meso level, one example of the meso level, sorry, this is going back to the meso level. One example of the meso level regime may be seen in this complex web of our current industrial food system, connecting many multiple sub-regimes within processes of production, distribution, and consumption. Beyond this, the existing food system regime is also related to other regimes such as water, transport, and energy, and is thus linked to the stability and norms of these other regimes. So we know industrial agriculture is a certain paradigm, again, of doing things, a certain set of institutions, and that's the meso level. Okay, on the niche level, we have these new innovations. On the micro level here. Okay, so the micro level is home to the niche innovations, new models, communities, or local networks on the micro level. The niche is defined as the locus for radical innovation, where dedicated actors nurture the development of new technological innovations or new innovations of any kind. The niche fosters and incubates innovations that differ fundamentally from the prevailing regime and usually require landscape developments that open windows of opportunity for them to enter in and disrupt the establishment. So from a systems theory perspective, these may be seen as the emerging new elements. Niche are located where it's possible to deviate from the rules in the existing regime to create new pathways. And they often require some kind of incubation or support. There'll often be regulation or some kind of incentives or policies to nurture these new innovations. For example, subsidies for electric cars or solar panels or whatever it is. So those are the niche there. And those are the three levels to this multi-level perspective: landscape, regime, and niche. Going beyond that, this is also a theory of change, right? So it's describing how change happens within that context of the three levels. So what Frank Giels is saying, the idea is that changes on this landscape level will disrupt this regime and create a window of opportunity for the new innovations to enter in, for those ones that are better adapted to this new context that's resulted from the landscape changes, and potentially they'll enter in, and if they're successful enough, they will be able to interconnect and interrelate and ultimately form a new system that's better adapted for this new context. And that's essentially the theory of change here. So the general idea is that this regime here is actually adapted for an old system, right? And that landscape is actually going to change the whole context. So it's actually no longer relevant for this new world. And that's going to create opportunities for these new innovations that are adapted to this new world to be able to enter in and disrupt and so forth. Okay, so that's the theory of change. Of how change happens within complex adaptive systems. You can see here this idea of windows of opportunity. The landscape are going to open up windows of opportunity for these niche here. Hopefully we'll understand that basic model. Quick question, if anybody wants to, anyone has one, we could spend a short while discussing that before we jump into actually working with this ourselves, right? So we're going to choose a system here. So I welcome anyone who would like to partake in working on this canvas to join on the mirror board and choose which system you'd like for us to talk about today. Just grab a dot, bring it down. I'm going to vote for, let me see, I'll just unlock these, sorry. Oh, no. Okay, so you should be able to grab a dot now and drag it down to whichever system you'd like for us to talk about. I'm going to choose media. Okay, we've got two for media, 2 for farming, 2 for society, 3, 4 for media. Okay, let's go with media for today, just as an experiment. So here's our canvas. It's a representation of the model we've been looking at with the different levels. And I'll just quickly walk you through. We'll be filling this out here. We can see the landscape changes. What are the landscape changes? What are the windows of opportunity? What does the dominant regime look like here? And then the niche level, the new innovations down here. We're going to fill those out. What's the window of opportunity that may be opening up here? How may the new innovations disrupt the regime? What does a new pattern look like? If these new innovations did manage to disrupt the establishment and interconnect to form a new paradigm, what would that look like? How might we enable the niche to do that? So we're talking about media here. So we know there's big changes happening there. There's an information revolution that's been ongoing in media for about 30 years now. We've seen big changes in terms of the rise of social media and new media of different form. And that is certainly transforming the landscape. Well, there's been landscape changes here, right? In the underlying technology of information that's really enabling the disruption of the established broadcast media. So let's start up here on the landscape level. What do we think are those landscape changes that are driving disruption and transformation here? So let's grab that, grab a sticky like that and reduce down a little bit. And then put in whatever you think those broader transformations are. Technological, they might be something to do with social values, so on and so forth. I'll take a couple of minutes to do that. If you have any questions, you need any help, feel free to shout it out or put it in the chat box. If you're not able to access the mirror board, you can put your comment in the chat and I'll paste it in. Okay, let's take a look at some of these. So Mark, I think you're asking about the role of the environment in this context. Definitely that would be part of it. I think it depends on what kind of a system you're looking at, right? So it's definitely part of this landscape here, right? If we're talking about water, we're talking about energy or whatever it may be, the big landscape changes there would be kind of environmental ones. So I think you'd be incorporating it as and where it's relevant. Maybe in the media it would be so relevant, but in other systems it would be. Okay. So here we have it. We'll talk about that. We'll talk about media, the big landscape changes in media. These are, it's not the system itself, right? It's the context within which it exists, right? And when the environment changes, a system that's dependent upon that environment must adapt, evolve, and change, right? So our media environment is actually ultimately it's about information exchange, right? So it's a system that exists within a broader information environment and information technology. So that's absolutely critical here. We know there are big changes there. We know it's already the introduction of the internet, the introduction of many-to-many or many-to-many communications is really driving big changes here. So that's the broader context. There may be others also, but that's one of the big changes around in the environment that's really going to drive change in this system for sure. So let's take a look here. Disruption due to multiple sources. Okay, what do we mean by sources? Different channels. Anybody want to say something about that? You're welcome to unmute yourself and join the conversation. Okay, David.
Yeah, I mean channels.
Yeah, different channels. Okay, like yeah, Twitter and WhatsApp and all this. Okay, so over simplification, what do we mean by that?
Oops, sorry. It's just meaning that there's a tendency for people to want things that are very simple, and sometimes the situations are complex, and people simplify it along to their agendas. So in that sense, that's a kind of a pressure of what people want and what is provided, but it alters. I felt that it alters the message, and it's an avenue for improvement, just as a potential pitfall.
Yeah, but then again, people have always wanted things simple, haven't they, and simplified. So the question is that something that's, it's an interesting, it's a cultural one, isn't it? It's about how much our kind of, our response to all this information and our mental models and so forth. I guess the question I'm asking is that a kind of a change that's really happening out there in the world? But it's good.
Maybe it's amplified, but yeah, no, it's not the most important one. You're right.
But there is an interesting question around, how much information can we deal with, right? Because we've got so much now. How much can our mental models deal with? That's something that is changing, right? People getting overloaded with information, for sure. Okay, so decentralized autonomous organizations, social media as a main source of information. Yep, high-tech driven polarized social media space, internet, definitely. Paper to digital, yeah, big transformation. Growing public distrust. Yeah, there's kind of a cultural aspect, social, psychological, cultural aspect, digitization, transparency, movement, content creation from few to anyone. Yeah. Kind of networked communications. The world can see everyone's opinion. Agriculture to produce paper, to proliferation of access to the internet. Okay, from reporting to sharing, fake news, deep fakes, distrust, Netflix binge during lockdown, deep learning algorithms, education. Yeah, it's an interesting one, isn't it? Like, are we becoming more educated so we can deal with more information and make sense of it and so forth? There probably are some changes there. So politicization of social media platforms and content. Yep. So yeah, the thing we want to keep in mind, are these big changes, are these things that are actually going to disrupt this system, or are they just small changes? We're talking about systems change here, right? If they aren't significant big changes out in the environment, that this system will probably chew them up and just adapt to them without actually changing its structure, right? So we do want to think about, obviously the internet, that is a systems changing sort of thing here, whereas something else may not be. So we do want to make sure that we're trying to get our really big landscape changes that are going on up here. That's the first thing to consider. Okay, let's take a look at the dominant regime. What does that look like? What is the incumbent system that we inherit from the industrial age that most of us would have grown up with? Broadcast media, we normally call it. What does that look like? Let's just take a couple of minutes to fill that in. Okay, for the sake of time, let's stay going. This is the question of what is the incumbent dominant regime in media look like? A lot of it's been disrupted already, so it's what we kind of grew up with, most of us, broadcast media. Evolution of established newspaper media groups, giant media and news agencies. Yep, reporters prepare the news. Yep. Telephone, private communications, bubbles, tribes, echo chambers, hunger for information. Yeah, there used to be a kind of a scarcity of information. Individualism, appearance and essence, broadband spectrum progression. Yeah, that's been a certain change. Maybe that would be something up here on the landscape level, right? Going from when I was growing up, having, I don't know what it was, 56 kilobytes of internet speed to 700 megabytes or something like this. That's a bit of a landscape change, right? Because we couldn't see video before very much on the internet, and now we can. Okay, electronic storage, emergence of multiple social media channels. Yeah, but is this the dominant regime? Not, that's a changing thing, isn't it, right? That's something that's happening, changing up on the landscape here. So in using this canvas, it's important, in using any kind of tool or canvas like this, it's important to try and get the right things in the right box, or else it's gonna get confused. So we are talking about the dominant regime here. The platforms may already be the dominant regime. They probably are to a certain extent, as we're noting here, Google, Amazon, Facebook, Apple, and Microsoft. Standard internet protocols and content review. YouTube and social media, influence of media over politics and vice versa. Yeah, so in this box, we're really trying to get a sense of what the system that's being changed looks like. That's an important thing for us to understand where we are at the moment before we can start thinking about where we're going. Any comments or questions about those first two boxes before we move on?
Hey, Joss, for the dominant regime, are you talking about kind of the prior big media era, or this moment? What is the dominant regime at this point in time?
Yeah. So as mentioned here, what's really going on here is the idea that systems change when there's a big change in the environment, right? They're adapted to their environment. They have to be adapted to their environment, and they can't be out of sync for that very long. So when a big systems change is happening, that's usually a product, some big change in the environment. So in this context, the dominant regime is what was adapted to the world before this big landscape transformation of the internet and peer-to-peer communications and so forth came along. But actually, in this context, this is broadcast media, not so much the platforms and so forth, right? What's over here would be the new model wherever we're going, right? And what this model doesn't capture so well, and we will look at in the future, is, will this new model be good or will it be bad? Will it be captured by the incumbents, or will it actually be something aspirational and so forth? We'll look at that more in the Three Horizons model in a future section. But here we should just be thinking about what is that system that was normalized, that was adapted for that old world, and over here this will be what will be adapted for this new world. Yeah. Okay, so let's take a look down here. The new innovations, what do they look like? What are the things that are actually adapted for this new world that are coming in here that have the potential to change the system, right? Not just little things, these should be very significant in terms of their capacity to disrupt and transform. Let's take a couple of minutes for that. Okay, I'll take a quick look at these before we move on. So these are the new innovations in the media context. Influencers, yep. Streaming and everybody being able to stream themselves. Bots, Udemy, SI, I like it. Virality, speed, lower startup costs. Yeah, it's quite amazing what you can do now on YouTube. Cost of almost zero, right? You can be broadcasting to millions of people almost unimaginable 30, 40 years ago. You were going nowhere without one of these incumbents, right? They would have had to have validated you and signed you up or whatever it is. Now you can go on YouTube and you can become a celebrity very quickly. Blog influencers, service-dominated logic, social media, VOD, what's this? VOD, video on demand platforms. I guess Netflix and so forth, artificial intelligence, unregulated content platform, social collaboration systems like Miro and Camus. Is that to do with the media landscape? I'm not sure it is. Might be more to do with work and so forth. Cheap access to media recording, contents produced is easily accessible in the future rather than lost once you read it and thrown it away. 24/7 new access, Internet of Things. Okay. Yeah, I wonder how many of these are real systems changing innovations. Obviously, social media is a huge one. Streaming, potentially. Yeah, so it would take time for us to actually think about this, right? We're just doing an exercise here. We'd have to do our research and so forth before we got to this stage. But those are the innovations. So last ones we have here, we're now going to look at what are these windows of opportunity, right? So this is the idea that this landscape here is going to drive changes that are going to create opportunities that this incumbent system can't really grab and can't really take avail of because it's not really adapted to this new environment, right? So you think about going back to the New York, there's a lot of talk, you know, back in the 90s when blogs came along and so forth, and we had those big media companies like the New York Times. But then in came all these bloggers, you know, because actually they were availing of the new opportunities here. Maybe the New York Times wasn't really set up to do that, was it? Because it already had its established channels. Blogging for it wasn't much of much use because it already had its audience and so forth. For these guys, they could take this new opportunity and to some extent disrupted this, even though the New York Times is still doing quite well. And is adapted in some ways. So sometimes this model can be a bit oversimplified in thinking that these are just going to disrupt and there's going to be a new one come along. As I said, in the future, we'll start thinking about, well, how does the old system potentially capture these new innovations and turn them to its new advantage and not have the system disrupted? Or how do these new innovations really disrupt the old one? How do we really get new possibilities emerging? That's more the three horizons model that we'll talk about in the future. But let's jump into this one. So what are the windows of opportunity here? Let's take a couple of minutes to post that up. What's the possibility, new possibilities that we can build new things on to disrupt this existing regime?
Row.
If you have any questions or anything you'd like to discuss, feel free to unmute yourself. Okay, I'm going to take a look at some of these. Kickstarter funded cinema. Yeah, that's an interesting one. And also, actually, the reduction in costs of, things like camera equipment and all of this is absolutely radical over the past 15 years. It used to be extremely expensive to make high quality video, and now your iPhone could make really stunning quality video. So actually, that reduction in cost itself is disruptive, but also funding mechanisms, distribution mechanisms, so on and so forth. Give everyone a voice. Yep. Patreon supported creators, more inclusive. Yep. Hear the voice of vulnerable, disadvantaged people. Yeah. I wonder, is this a window of opportunity? I'm not sure. Capture wider perspectives. Is this a way? Is this an opportunity that we're going to disrupt the established system? Possibly. Possibly. I mean, the established system, it can only do so much. It's limited in its bandwidth, right? Because it's centralized. Definitely on YouTube and so forth, we can get a lot more perspectives and opinions. Is that going to enable disruption? I'm not sure. Order emerging from chaos, reach, social network distribution, gauging of trends through YouTube, set for platforms. Yeah. Individualized audiences, Substack, Slack groups. Yeah, we can have new kinds of conversations, can't we? We could never really properly have down here on the media ones. We got invited every now and then to contribute our little bit here and there, but we didn't really get to have these kind of conversations and form these communities and so forth that we can on Slack and so forth. That potentially is hugely disruptive. AI generated content, cult creation. What's this up here? Using data to better curate news and information for users. Yep. Crowdfunding, alternative independent media channels based on common benefit and not on companies' benefit. Yeah, so this system down here was very much dominated by commercial interests, wasn't it? We know that it became, it was one thing we objected to about it, wasn't it? It became very orientated towards kind of commercial motives. And we know that up here now we can have all sorts of communities kind of sprouting all over the place that aren't particularly interested in money. And they can say all sorts of things and have new conversations and so forth. So that is potentially very, very disruptive, right? Okay, so how may the new innovations disrupt the regime? So there's a slight kind of nuance and subtlety in the difference there. That's the opportunities that are emerging. And how might these guys down here bridge into the mainstream and use this window of opportunity to bridge into the mainstream and disrupt this incumbent system? So it may be difficult for us to discern the difference between kind of windows of opportunity and these disruptions. Maybe some of these up here belong down here. Let's take a minute to post that one up and think about it. Of course, we're just doing an exercise here because we're learning about the canvas. So hopefully all the time you're thinking about, how this is working and so forth rather than the actual content. Okay, for the sake of time, let's jump in, take a look at some of these. So we're talking about how may the new innovations disrupt the regime. New revenue models, yeah, business models, definitely. Netflix, that's part of what it's doing, isn't it? That's how it's been doing disruptions. So Cambridge Analytics, create greater extremes of users and content. Can challenge what is being said, reported. Yeah, there's a much bigger kind of feedback mechanism now. Change cultural norms. It's a good point. It's not all about information technology. It's also about people's expectations and cultural values and norms and so forth. Peel away audiences. What do we mean by this?
So, I mean, if people are spending their time on alternative, channels and innovations, and they're spending less time on, traditional broadcast or traditional media.
Yep. Okay. Introduce contrary opinions and voices. Yeah, democratization of the internet, alternative to polarization through channels like Al Jazeera, RT. Yeah. Okay. So we're coming close to time here. Let's take a quick look. We've got 2 more boxes here. Let's just take this top one up here. So the bottom one is about how may we foster and enable these new niches, but let's just jump into this one as our last one. What do we think this new pattern might look like? What could be the system if this really came to pass? What could come out of it if these managed to disrupt the establishment? Let's take just two minutes to do that. Okay, we've reached the end of our time, so we'll wrap up there. These were just talking about the new pattern, what that might look like. Could empower new voices to get involved. Yeah, revenue shared in a completely new way. Decentralization, but network communications, decentralized, censorship-free, resistant to manipulation by bad actors, choice, and so on. The stuff around disinformation. Great, we're going to wrap up there. Hopefully that gave you an idea of this tool we call the multi-level perspective. It's one of the most prominent, most used tools in the area of systems change for thinking about these big changes coming about in socio-technical systems and how to make them change, how to make them happen. So it's, as you've seen, it's a theory of change as to how the landscape can open up these new windows of opportunity for these new niche innovations to enter in, disrupt the established system, and potentially results in the emergence of a new system. As we can see, it's quite problematic. We know this transformation that's going on in media is very complex and it's multidimensional, and there's lots of good and there's lots of bad to it, you know. So that's one thing for us to recognize. I'm glad we chose this topic actually, because we know that's actually a transformation that's been ongoing, and most of us have lived through it for the past 20 years or so. So we've seen a lot of the kind of complicated, it's not simple, is it, right? So a lot of those, I talked about New York Times, that hasn't disappeared, right? It's actually been very good at adapting to this technology and building their own platform, and actually are quite dominant still. And we know that some of these things have turned out quite ugly, you know, Facebook and fake news and so forth. So it's never simple, this transition process. And sometimes these models can give us an oversimplification. So we should remember just to be cautious. This is one way of looking at it. It can help us in many ways. It's very useful to help us think about the bigger picture and the different aspects. But it's just a tool, it's a simplification, and we need different tools. And that's why in coming sections, we'll be talking about many more different tools. This is not the only one talking about transition processes or systems change. It's just the one we're talking about today. 3 horizons, we'll look at 2 loops, we'll talk about leverage points and so forth in coming sessions. So if you get a more kind of comprehensive view of the different aspects here, once again, systems change on this scale, and how it happens and how we might make it happen is a very complex process. So we need to be wary of any one kind of model. But hopefully you got an idea for its workings and how it may be of use when thinking about how to make systems innovation happen. We're going to wrap up there. Thanks very much for joining. Next time we'll be coming back in a month from now. We'll be talking about a little bit about systems change. We'll talk about the 3 horizons model, which is also looking at the same kind of transition process or systems change process.
Thanks, Josh. Great work.
Thank you, Bob. Thanks everyone for joining. I hope to see you again
Josh.
next month.
Just